Hey, good afternoon. I'm Michael O'Loughlin, America Magazine's national correspondent. We're here at America Magazine's studio in New York. And if you've been on social media at all today, you know that today is the 5th anniversary of the election of Pope Francis. We've been tweeting out about stories we've written covering the anniversary, retrospectives back at what he's accomplished the last 5 years. And we're really excited now to have a couple special guests with us to talk about Pope Francis, what he's accomplished, and what we can look forward to in the coming years. So my first guest is David Gibson. Dave is the director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University.
A Jesuit university.
The Jesuit University.
The Jesuit University.
That's right.
Of New York. Yes.
A former award-winning reporter and author. Dave has an essay in the new book, Pope Francis Lexicon. Also with me is my colleague at America, Father James Martin. Father Jim is editor-at-large of America, author of several books, including an essay in Pope Francis Lexicon.
All the good people are in there.
All the good people. We have a lot of good stuff in here. If you haven't checked it out, it's available wherever books are sold. And Jim is also the author of this book, Building a Bridge, How the Catholic Church and the LGBT Community Can Enter into a Relationship of Respect, Compassion, and Sensitivity. Thanks for being with us, guys.
My pleasure.
So this is an exciting day. We've seen a lot of people weighing in on Pope Francis, what he means for the church. And I know people out there are excited to hear what you guys have to say, too. So I want to just ask kind of a basic, simple question. I know you were both in Rome during the election 5 years ago. Tell me, what was that like? What was that experience like? Start with you, Dave.
I was going to make a joke. But it really is a remarkable experience. You can't to be there. I was there in 2005, and then in March 13th, 2013, for the election of Francis. And it's the first thing you have to realize is that in 2005 there hadn't been an election for more than 26 years of a pope, because Pope John Paul II had such a long reign. So it was like, wow, this is new to me. And then you realize, this is new to everybody. There was only one or two cardinals, including Joseph Ratzinger, in the conclave of 2005, who had been in the conclave of 1978. Then, 8 years later, we're back, and you're waiting to see who's going to walk out on that balcony. It's a remarkable moment. I was staying there with some other colleagues, and it was just sort of butterflies in your stomach, wondering who's going to lead the church. The Pope is not everything. But boy, a pope sure can make a difference.
Sure. So, Father Jim, you're there. You're covering the event, covering the conclave and the election, and you hear the name Bergoglio. This is the election has happened. You kind of know who this guy is, right?
I do, or I did. I wasn't actually in Rome. I was in New York in a TV studio helping out on ABC, and the name was announced, and he was known to Jesuits, for better or worse, as someone who was very rigid and very authoritarian during his time as provincial of Argentina. And so my first reaction was pretty much horror. And in fact, I gasped on air, and they told me to shut up because, he was someone who had a reputation of being very inflexible. And I started getting texts from Jesuits saying, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. We're going to be in cassocks in a year or two. That was a memorable text. But, very quickly, after he chose the name Francis, you knew something was different. And then he came out and he made, for me, that famous bow where he asked people to pray for him. And then within a day or two, when he was talking about, the one I remember is in front of the journalists, maybe Dave was there, where he said, how I want a church that is poor and for the poor. And I thought, who is this guy? It was a reminder not to let, your understanding of someone from 40 years ago color, your current sort of perception of the person.
That's really true. I mean, and again, he's talked about, and in his first major interview with Antonio Spadaro in America Magazine, which is still the definitive, I think, interview. Just go back and read that if you want to know what Bergoglio is, what Pope Francis is. But he talked about his authoritarian tendencies, how he made mistakes when he was younger. Obviously, in the context of the Argentine Dirty War in the 1970s, he was 36 or something.
He was
provincial.
Way too young.
He was young and made mistakes. But that's also part of, and again, that, as happens with so many, your reputation gets frozen in time. And he is someone, it's fascinating because he was a surprise, I think, to a lot of people. He was unknown to a lot of people, or his reputation did not match what he was. But actually, if you knew Bergoglio in these recent years, recent couple of decades in Argentina, you probably would not be so surprised by what you've gotten.
Yeah, although the Jesuits in Argentina tell me that one of the changes, he's always been, very much associated with the poor, very simple, very holy. The warmth is new, they say. The warm and fuzzy part is very new.
What do you make of that?
I think the grace of the office. I think the Holy Spirit changes people. I also think he's probably free. And also, the Jesuits may not have seen him up close. I think there's a certain sense that he understands the value of gestures, too. He knows what it means not only to say that we need to reach out to marginalized people, but to literally hug them, as he did in that famous photo with the man with the disfiguring skin condition. So he understands gestures, too.
Sure. So speaking of some of those kind of groundbreaking moments, America has published this special issue, Pope Francis, 5 Groundbreaking Years. You can buy this on newsstands. You can visit americamagazine.org for information about ordering it online. Both Father Jim and Dave and myself have all contributed essays to it. And Dave, I wanted to ask you a question about your essay. Some of the Pope's critics who are resisting some of the reforms that he's proposed, they say that he represents sort of a dramatic rupture from the past, that he's kind of thwarting the papacies of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. But you argue in your essay here that that's actually not the case. Can you kind of explain that a little bit for us?
Well, I think it's just the opposite. In fact, I think he's going back. He's recovering the tradition, which had always been there. Again, Pope Benedict today on this anniversary was quoted as talking about the foolish prejudice. Words of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI.
Yeah.
Talking about the foolish prejudice of those who would pit him, Benedict, against Francis, and citing Francis's theological and philosophical sophistication. But again, there are these continuities, but I think Francis has succeeded in bringing out the traditions that I think had been submerged or subsumed or hadn't been clarified. Francis is a great communicator, and the idea of a church of mercy, a pastoral church, rather than one of dogmatic rules and application, Pharisaical application, and change, a church that changes. Every time a new pope is elected, as Father Jim has said, the church changes in some way. And I think, as Father John O'Malley, a great Jesuit church historian, has said, change is the tradition. So he's not going back. The church does not go backwards. But as with the Second Vatican Council, he's opening up processes. He's not imposing conclusions. Again, he doesn't come in there with an agenda. He wants to open up with synods, with dialogue, with listening to people, and seeing where the Holy Spirit leads. The Holy Spirit's often the overlooked part of the Trinity, I think, in the Catholic Church.
Sure. So speaking of mercy, Pope Francis has made mercy kind of the centerpiece of his papacy, and we had a year of mercy. And Father Jim, your book, Building a Bridge, is about your ministry with the LGBT community in the church. It's received a lot of feedback, a lot of praise in recent months, and you have a new edition out this year. I'm curious, how did Pope Francis and his emphasis on mercy impact this kind of ministry to marginalized groups?
Well, I think his 5 most famous words are, "Who am I to judge?" And that was initially directed towards gay priests, and then the next day he expanded it to be sort of referring to LGBT people in general. Frankly, that has really brought a lot of LGBT people back to the church. It's helped them be more sympathetic to the church. But really, this book could not have been written without Pope Francis because of the environment that he created. Some of the people that blurbed the book, Cardinal Kevin Farrell, Cardinal Tobin, they weren't in their positions before Pope Francis came. And so
this is Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who leads the Vatican's family office. So this is a pretty big kind of endorsement of this kind of ministry to issues that affect families.
That's right. I mean, he's the prefect of that congregation, that dicastery. And Pope Francis really created the space for this conversation to happen. I'm not the only one that's having this conversation. Cardinal Tobin, Archbishop of Newark, had a welcome mass for LGBT people last summer, which simply would not have happened for 2 reasons. 1, the environment, and 2, his predecessor wasn't open to those kinds of things, wasn't as open to those kinds of things. So, as Dave was saying, the Pope can't change everything, but he can change a lot.
Sure.
And I think I'd just add, there's some criticism, and I would not overplay that criticism. It's a very small but vocal and influential to some degree cohort holier than thou, often Catholics. But I think what Francis is doing is he's not favoring suddenly one group. He's not favoring LGBT Catholics. He's not favoring liberal Catholics or some others. He's simply leveling the playing field. There's no special exemption for divorced and remarried Catholics, gay Catholics, or anybody. He's leveling the playing field. We're all sinners. It's the first thing. That's how he describes himself. And we all are in the same boat. There are no sins, there are no sinners who are greater sinners or lesser sinners. We all have to approach God and approach mercy in the same way.
That's right. And as journalists here, as observers of the church, obviously Pope Francis has been a fascinating figure to cover, right? But there's also some challenges he faces. I'm wondering if either one of you can talk about areas where the Pope's been maybe criticized a little bit, and talk a little bit about how he might address some of those criticisms.
Yeah, I would say the two areas that I point to, and I don't want to steal Dave's thunder, but number one, sex abuse. I think he has a long way to go in terms of sex abuse, in terms of particularly holding bishops accountable, removing bishops who would have moved priests around, for example. I think the situation in Chile, where he was criticized about his treatment of Bishop Barros, now he's sent Archbishop Scicluna down to investigate that, I think is a good step. But I think he has a long way to go. And I really think that, in terms of women, some of his statements and some of the ways he speaks about women really frustrate a lot of women, certainly women in the West. And so those, for me, I think he's done a great job. I would give him an A. But I think what would prevent me from giving him an A+ would be sex abuse and women.
And I agree with that. Those are the two main things that stand out. And I think even some reforms of the Curia, I think, are messier than expected. But is to be expected, knowing the Curia and knowing Rome a bit. But I think also, unfortunately, it's at the expense of sex abuse victims and women. But I think these shortcomings of his are also in their way a salutary thing for the church, in the sense that the Pope, it's terrible. We can't go from conservatives holding up Benedict, for example, or St. John Paul II as the Pope, as the great champion, and then all of a sudden liberals say, oh, we've got our Pope, and he's our champion. No, we have to, and Francis is the first one to say we have to be normal. These are human beings. Popes are human beings. Popes retire now. Sure. That's also the great change that's happened. And we have to see popes as having their own shortcomings and their own failings that another pope will have to address, and perhaps in a better way.
Sure. So if you're just joining us, we're doing a special Facebook Live here at America Magazine in New York, commemorating the 5-year anniversary of Pope Francis's election. And if you're out there watching on Facebook and have some questions, send them in. We'd love to have Dave and Father Jim address them. And I think we have a question now that we have from a viewer. Pope Benedict recently commented on the continuity between him and Francis. What makes you? Why do you think he feels this way? Why did he feel compelled to make these comments? Dave, you talked about this a little bit.
Yeah, I think very much there's a sense that Benedict is being used, being pitted against Francis in a way to make invidious comparisons, and it can happen the other way too, as well. And I think Benedict, felt he took the occasion of a release of a series of books on the theology of Francis to state on this occasion of the 5th anniversary that there are deep continuities, he said, between the two men, even as, he said, there's difference in style and temperament and personality. So again, there's often, Benedict is a very pragmatic, very human person, and there's, something I push back against, and I think as a church we need to, and I think it's been a helpful thing in this past decade of 2 or 3 popes, is the idea that you have popes are human beings, and you have a new pope, you have a different style. Popes are people. There's often a tendency to try and make such a uniform consistency between them that it winds up being, frankly, dishonest.
Sure. And Father Jim, you've done a lot of talks and visits to parishes, and my impression from talking to you is that when you're there, you see a lot of unity in the church, that people are really excited about this Pope, that they're excited about his ministry. But as Dave mentioned earlier, there is a small but loud faction of people who, like you said, maybe use Pope Benedict to push their own agenda, even though Pope Benedict's now pushing back. What are you finding in parishes that people kind of feel about this Pope?
They love him, basically. Although the people that come to see me, to talk, are people that I think generally like the Jesuits and like Pope Francis. One of the things I find interesting is that some of the pushback that we're hearing about, when you talk about that in parishes, most Catholics could care less about these kind of small traditionalist websites, and they don't know them, they don't pay attention to them. I think they're very powerful in terms of Vatican circles and maybe in terms of the media, but for the person in the pews, they like Pope Francis, they like their pastor, they like their parish, and they hopefully they like their bishop too. But I think they like him as a person. I think that's part of it. And one of the things I think is important to see is that for Francis, his words sort of give meaning to his deeds, and his deeds give meaning to his words. I mean, in a sense, as I said before, he not only says we need to reach out to the poor, but he literally and physically reaches out to the poor. And it's very much like Jesus. He speaks with authority. And, as Dave was saying, popes appeal to different people. And some people found St. John Paul appealing. Some people found Pope Benedict appealing. Some people find Pope Francis appealing. And I think the difficulty for me is when people say, no, you should only find John Paul and Benedict appealing. You can't like this guy. It's okay to like different kinds of popes. That's fine. That's part of the sort of creativity of the Church and the Holy Spirit. So, but I agree with Benedict, of course. Pitting them against one another is ridiculous. You don't have to cut one down to build one up.
Sure. So again, we're doing a Facebook Live here at America Magazine about Pope Francis's 5th election, and we have another question from one of the viewers. Both for Dave and Father Jim. If you were betting men, would you bet that Francis retires like his predecessor, or that he dies in office? Sort of a grim topic, but this is how we get new popes.
I would bet that he retires. I think Benedict. I thought one of the humblest acts in church history was the retirement of Pope Benedict, and I think Pope Francis. Remember, Jesuit provincials are only in their provincialate for 6 years, and they know to sort of step aside. And I think he's pragmatic enough to know that when it's time to go. I find it very interesting that people who try to pit people against one another and say what's good, what's bad, need to remember that St. John Paul did exactly the opposite of what Pope Benedict did. And here are two holy men that discerned the same thing, should I stay on or should I go, in different ways. So it shows, again, the value of discernment and the need for us to kind of look at each individual, on his own terms.
I do think in very, bringing it down to very pragmatic and perhaps profane terms, I think it will depend. Obviously, it depends on the health of Francis. He's also very pragmatic. If something happened to him, and he felt he couldn't go on, I think he would retire from office, health-wise. And obviously, he could die at any time. But he's 81 years old. But I think a lot depends also on what happens with Benedict the 16th, who is still sound of mind, as you can tell, and he's still. Able to write and do various things. He's writing prefaces to books and things like that. But I don't think, the retirement of Benedict, I think, was a great act and an important act. But having two retired popes could be a little bit problematic. You start to get a little crowded. So I think Francis is kind of keeping an eye on Benedict to see what happens there. There are various reports that Benedict's health is failing. He's 90 now, something like that. And he said his energies are going. He's obviously very frail. But who knows how long he's going to go on. So I think that is going to weigh on Francis's calculations, as it were.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks, guys. This has been fun. Again, David Gibson, who's the director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University here in New York, and Father James Martin, editor-at-large of America and author of Building a Bridge. This is America Magazine, New York. I'm Michael O'Loughlin, national correspondent. Thanks for watching.
Good stuff. Now, back to SportsCenter.